Zombies are awesome. Zombie films are awesome. Zombie games are awesome. There is something so endlessly captivating about the idea of a zombie apocalypse and surviving in one, and the ethical choices that you'd have to make to survive in one. And it's amazing that in the modern age, we have fully fledged open world zombie games like Project Zomboid and Days Gone, which let us explore these fascinating scenarios. You might be surprised to learn that certain types of academic philosopher actually talk about zombies a lot. There's a type of argument known as the zombie argument in a field of philosophy called the analytic philosophy of consciousness, or the analytic philosophy of mind. So I thought in this video I could tell you what philosophers mean when they talk about zombies and why they talk about zombies, and what a zombie argument is. It will disappoint you to know that when philosophers use the word zombie, they don't mean the zombies we all know and love. I, for one, was very disappointed by this. Philosophers don't mean the delightful, brain-eating, shambling, violent, decaying monsters of pop culture. For them, a zombie is a different type of imaginary entity, a creature they use in thought experiments and arguments about consciousness. A philosophical zombie is an imaginary being which is physically identical to a human being, but which does not have conscious experience. So a zombie is constituted the same way we are, looks like we do, acts like we do, but doesn't have any conscious experience at all. It reacts the same way to stimuli. If you poke a philosophical zombie, it will say, "Ow, why are you poking me, you lunatic?" and recoil. But the difference is that the zombie wouldn't feel any actual pain. Our zombie brethren go through life acting like us, looking like us, and seeming like us, and acting exactly like we do, and they're physically identical to us, but the difference is they don't experience anything, feel nothing, and are not conscious of their own existence. Another way of putting this is to say that there is nothing that it's like to be a zombie. This is a spin on a famous definition of consciousness given by the philosopher Thomas Nagel in a particularly important article for the Analytic Philosophy of Consciousness called "What is it like to be a bat?", published in 1974. Nagel argued that something is conscious if there is something that it is like to be that thing, something that it's like to experience being that thing. Just as there's something that it's like to experience drinking coffee, being in love, hearing a piece of music, watching a film, and so on. These are all particular experiences. There is also something that it's like to be a person. We experience our being from a subjective perspective. There is something that it is like to be ourselves. Since the zombie has no subjective experience or no conscious experience, there is nothing that it's like to be a zombie. There's nothing to experience. Now, you might think that the philosophical zombie is a really weird idea, or that it doesn't make sense, or that it wouldn't be really possible at all. And this is precisely what philosophers are debating when they talk about zombies. They're debating whether or not they're conceivable or possible, and what their conceivability or possibility means for how we think about stuff like consciousness. Zombie arguments are a type of what philosophers call modal arguments, meaning they're arguments about logical possibility and necessity. Modal logic is all about figuring out what's logically possible or impossible, and what's logically necessary and what's not, what has to be the case by necessity and what doesn't. Some philosophers think the logical conceivability or possibility of zombies has radical implications for how we understand the nature of consciousness and reality. Zombie arguments are most often used by philosophers when trying to argue against a view called physicalism, which is the thesis that everything in reality is ultimately physical in nature. So physicalism is a form of what's called monism, which is the idea that reality is ultimately made out of only one kind of stuff, one type of substance, and that we don't need to posit any extra different kind of substance to fully explain how reality is constituted. Dualism would be the view that reality is ultimately made up of two substances, which are different in nature. Monism argues that there's just one. So physicalism is the thesis that everything ultimately is physical. Everything ultimately reduces to the physical and can be explained in terms of the physical. There is nothing over and above the physical, no extra stuff that we need to posit to fully explain the constitution of reality. All facts are ultimately determined by and reducible to and explainable by physical facts, as science understands the word physical. Zombie arguments are often used in attempts to demonstrate that physicalism is false. So what is a zombie argument? Well, this area of philosophy is surprisingly complicated. There are lots of different types of zombie arguments, lots of different people who make them, and lots of arguments for and against the positions taken in relation to zombie arguments. Here we'll have to be somewhat basic and brief, so we'll just stick with probably the most famous way they've been formulated, which captures the general gist of what they're going for. The most famous development of a zombie argument comes from a philosopher called David Chalmers' 1996 book, The Conscious Mind. And the outline of it goes something like this. Premise 1. According to physicalism, everything that exists in our world, including consciousness, is physical. Premise 2. If physicalism is true, a metaphysically possible world in which all physical facts are the same as those of the actual world must contain everything that exists in our actual world, including consciousness. Premise 3. We can conceive of a world physically indistinguishable from our world, but in which there is no consciousness, a zombie world. From this it follows that such a world is metaphysically possible. Conclusion: physicalism is false. Let's break this down a bit. When Chalmers talks about possible worlds here, he means this in the sense that philosophers understand the term in modal logic, as a world that can be conceived of without a logical contradiction, a completely consistent way that our world could have possibly been or could possibly be, but which it isn't or it wasn't. As is always the case in philosophy, there are different definitions and understandings of what a possible world is. But I think this is a fairly common and basic sense of the term that generally gets at what these theories are driving at. So why would we talk about possible worlds? Well, most people, I think, would accept that our world didn't necessarily have to be the way it's turned out to be. Different things could have happened, history could have gone differently, evolution could have gone differently. It's totally conceivable that a world like this one could have existed without humans ever having evolved in it. Possible worlds theories think about these types of reflections and what they mean and what they can tell us about the actual world. So a possible world is a way our world could have been, or could be, that can be imagined and conceived of without there being a contradiction in the concepts involved in doing it. So when John Lennon sings about imagining a world where there's no countries and that everyone lives in peace, he's not talking about the world as it actually is, he's imagining a possible future world, presumably one that he idealistically thought was actually possible. There could be a possible world in which I went to the office this morning rather than stayed home. No logical contradiction there. This is totally imaginable, totally conceivable. It just didn't happen. But I cannot imagine a world with a square circle in it. I'm literally not able to do this because there's a logical contradiction in the concepts of square and circle. Something can't be both square and circle at the same time because this is logically contradictory. It's like saying something is X and not X. You can't have both at the same time. When philosophers talk about possible worlds and try to figure out what is and isn't possible to imagine, they're trying to figure out how our thought and our logic and our reasoning work, the limits of what they're capable of and the implications of anything they discover in this type of inquiry for things like the nature of consciousness or the nature of knowledge and reality. Philosophers often use the idea of a zombie to figure out whether or not physicalism is true. On the view of physicalism, everything that exists in our world is physical. So if we imagine a possible world which is physically identical to ours, it should, by necessity, have consciousness in it. Our world is physical and has consciousness in it, so a world which is physically identical to ours should have consciousness in it too. We shouldn't be able to conceive of a world that's exactly physically like ours, but which doesn't have conscious experience in it. But Chalmers and other proponents of zombie arguments argue that we actually can conceive of a zombie world, and that there is no logical contradiction in doing so. They then go a step further with a type of argument that's become known as the conceivability argument, which says zombies are conceivable, whatever is conceivable is possible, so zombies are possible. So if we can conceive of a physical copy of our world with no consciousness in it, and such a world is logically possible, this means that the nature of consciousness can't be fully captured in purely physical terms. We need something else. If there could be a logically possible world full of physically identical beings to us going around and looking and behaving just as we do, but which aren't conscious, then there is more to consciousness than the physical. It can't be explained in purely physical terms. Physicalism is therefore false, because there's something, consciousness, that physicalism can't explain. Now, I can't go into all the arguments around zombie arguments in a short video like this, and it's not really my area of expertise in philosophy, but I'll just give you a very brief response to the zombie argument and tell you what I think about it. There will be other people, I'm sure, that have already said what I'm about to say. I'm not claiming to be original or anything, but this is just what I think. I also know that I've barely scratched the surface with zombie arguments, with what people like Chalmers and others have said about them, or arguments they've given for and against the views that they take in relation to zombie arguments, but this isn't a journal article or a dissertation, it's a YouTube video. Maybe I'll do another one on it in the future. What do I think about this? Well, I'm not a physicalist. I don't believe that physicalism is true. I do not think consciousness can be adequately explained with full justice done to it in purely physical terms. I think we need another kind of language with a different conceptual or philosophical vocabulary, with different types of facts to adequately describe and understand the nature and character of conscious experience and all the important aspects of conscious experience, or the social being and politics and history that go along with conscious beings and their experience of reality. I do not believe that all the facts about consciousness can ultimately be reduced to physical facts about the brain, the body, and the behaviour and interaction of physical phenomena. Whenever I think about things like this, I'm always reminded of something called Hempel's dilemma, associated with the philosopher Karl Hempel. Hempel worried about the fact that all our physicalist and scientific attempts to explain reality, however concrete and objective they may be, still rely on human language and our imperfect concept of the physical in order to be communicated and formulated. His dilemma centred on the fact that our understanding of the physical might well change in the future. I'm paraphrasing here, but the idea is that we have two options when thinking about consciousness and the physical. Either, one, we accept science's current definition of the physical, which can't adequately explain things like consciousness, or two, we define the physical based on a future ideal science that's worked everything out. But this is completely empty because we don't know what that will be, and the future definition of the physical might well include the mental or consciousness in it. So I'm not a physicalist because our current understanding of what it means for something to be physical can't fully explain consciousness, and we'll have to wait and see what the future conceptions of the physical might be. I think they could well be very different from what we currently have and what we're currently able to imagine. And the meaning of physical might change dramatically such that it's unrecognisable from what we have now. So in our era's understanding of the physical, I'm not a physicalist. But while I'm not a physicalist, zombie arguments have never made a word of sense to me. I don't think the argument even gets off the ground because I doubt that zombies are even conceivable in the first place. I don't really think we can conceive of a world full of beings that are physically identical to us, but which are not conscious, because whether you're a physicalist or not, it can't be denied that we are physically constituted beings and that our consciousness is wrapped up inextricably with our physical nature, even if our consciousness cannot be understood in purely physical terms. If we damage the brain, we damage our consciousness. If zombies are physically identical to us, they simply will be conscious. I think the idea of a world in which they're not is incoherent. We are physical beings, and our consciousness is bound to our physical nature. But this doesn't mean that physicalism can fully account for the nature and character of conscious experience either. One does not follow from the other. There's a massive amount of the subjective character of consciousness that purely physical explanations will not be able to account for. But this does not mean zombies are conceivable. I do think there is a contradiction in the idea of a philosophical zombie. The main reason for thinking this, I think, has to do with the way that zombie arguments treat consciousness. They treat it as though it was something just going on inside your head, and as though it were entirely limited to psychological feelings. But in reality, consciousness extends into our body and into the world, and manifests itself in our actions and behaviour. Let's go back to the example of a philosophical zombie being poked and recoiling in pain and saying, "Ow," but feeling nothing. To me, recoiling and saying "ow" would be part of the consciousness of feeling pain. In describing the zombie's reaction to pain, you're describing part of the process of someone being conscious of pain. This is kind of what the late Daniel Dennett, a famous physicalist philosopher, argued. He said that the experience of being in pain isn't something which we can just pluck out of a person's mental life and detach from its physical aspects. I think this is actually right. The subjective mental feeling which accompanies pain always goes along with a bodily reaction, physiological changes, but also with expressions of being in pain and the behaviours that go along with these expressions, like recoiling and saying "ow" and moving to avoid the cause of your pain. This is all part of the consciousness of pain, not simply the psychological experience of a painful feeling. Whether or not physicalism as a theory is able to capture the subjective character of consciousness of pain is just another question entirely. But on the point that the experience of being in pain isn't just something we can detach from its physical aspects, I think Dennett's right. I also agree with Dennett when he says that when philosophers claim that zombies are conceivable, they invariably underestimate the task of conception or imagination, and end up imagining something that violates their own definition. In imagining a zombie world and describing how zombies are and behave, proponents of zombie arguments end up describing beings which clearly possess some degree of consciousness and manifest some degree of consciousness, however much they try not to describe this. But this undermines the very idea of the whole argument. Zombies are not supposed to be conscious at all. All of this, to me at least, testifies to the idea that zombies aren't really conceivable at all. They're not really able to be coherently imagined without a contradiction. But this puts me in a minority among surveyed professional philosophers. Only 16% of those surveyed by the Phil People website, out of 175 responses, said they thought that zombies were inconceivable. But of course I'm open to my mind being changed. Thanks so much for watching this video about the zombie argument, although I think I'll prefer to stick with our flesh-eating friends we all know and love so well in the future. Do like and subscribe for more content, and we'll see you in the future.